This program is brought to you by Emory University.
So for short people. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm sorry, this is for a shorter person. My name is Sita Ranchad Nelson, and I direct Emory's Institute for Developing Nations. And on behalf of the Institute, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening for this very timely discussion of the conflict that's happening in South Sudan, North Sudan, and its historical antecedents in Sudan. The Institute for Developing Nations works with our partner institution, the Carter Center, to develop programs that advance scholarship on issues that the Carter Center is working on, and also to host events like this that bring real-time, real-world problems to the Emory community. I want to offer a warm welcome to our panelists this evening. It's a great pleasure to see them here. Our panelists and some of our honored guests in the audience are here in Atlanta to meet with the Carter Center about Sudan, and they have graciously agreed to spend an extra day or two with us in order to participate in this event this evening. And also earlier today, there was a wonderful discussion in the law school about international mediation in Sudan. I also want to thank my colleagues in the Carter Center's Peace Program for making this evening possible, and especially Itonde Kakoma, the Assistant Director of Conflict Resolution. And at this point, I'm actually going to ask Itonde to come up and say a few words about the Carter Center's work in Sudan and to introduce our honored guests. So thank you for being with us this evening.
Good evening. Are you able to hear me if I stand upright? Good. Sita, thank you very much for the welcome and the hospitality. We're honored to be here in the library. I was chatting with some of your colleagues at the university at a reception. They were reminding us that, in fact, the Carter Center's work began in this very library. So it is good to be, in a sense, home again. The Carter Center has worked in Sudan for upwards of nearly 3 decades now. And this year marks the 30th year anniversary, led by our President and CEO, Dr. John Hardman, here with us, and other colleagues who are present with us, our Vice President for Peace Programs, Dr. John Stremlaw, who is somewhere in the midst of the audience there, Craig Withers, Dr. Craig Withers from our health programs, who is also somewhere in the midst of the audience, and I also see Dr. Steve Hochman previously there as well. Those 30 years of engagement have entailed health, agriculture, and under a broad category of peace-related work. Vince Farley, who is sitting here in the front row, served as a diplomat in residence at the Carter Center and can remind me of a number of stories about the way in which the center, through the efforts of President Carter, has been instrumental, or I should say, has offered a supporting hand, a helping hand, through very turbulent times, not only in Sudan, but in the wider region there. We continue to have a presence, so it's not simply a historic narrative by any means. Our health programs especially have focused the remaining push for the eradication of guinea worm throughout the world in South Sudan. And Craig Withers, whom I mentioned, is very much spearheading that effort. Our peace programs are also present. not only in historic terms. Vince was reminding me that the Carter Center, and specifically President Carter, I should say, during the Camp David peace accords, while in the White House, ensured that Sudan was, in a sense, on the table. So it is an issue of deep concern to him. And we've inherited that as our legacy in the efforts that we do as a center. From the peace program side, Jeffrey Mappinderry, who will be properly introduced, represents both observation work in terms of constitutional development and political processes, and exploring ways our conflict resolution activities can be of assistance, as post-independence for both states has by no means meant the resolution of conflict, which is an irony. The completion of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, July 9th, by no means meant the completion of conflict. 6 months on, you see both states still trying to work out deep-seated issues, both at an historic level and at a technical level. At a technical level, outstanding issues that will, I'm sure, be explored this evening include border demarcation. At the law school today, it was noted by Dr. John Ruach to describe yourself as a country without specified borders raises many questions. This remains unresolved. Additionally, questions around citizenship are still to be negotiated. And most pressingly in the media and on the hearts and minds of many Sudanese and South Sudanese are disputes on oil revenue sharing. February 10th, this past Friday, the two respective governments signed a memorandum of understanding on non-aggression and cooperation, specifically in light of the government of South Sudan's decision to shut off the oil pipelines, representing more than 90% of revenue for the economy of the South, and upwards of, please correct me, more than 60% of revenue for the North. This is a decisive decision, right? And has forced them to sit down again and hopefully reason together. Unfortunately, senior military officials in the South said only hours after that agreement was signed this past Friday, bombing took place along the northern border in Yao. This evening we are grateful to explore these questions in depth. Deborah Scroggins will be moderating our panel. Among many things, she is, I believe, a native of Atlanta somehow, and an international reporter at the time, for Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and was covering Sudan very closely, and specifically humanitarian crises that are analogous to what is being experienced to some extent today still, which led to her critically acclaimed book, Emma's War, reflecting on the politics of humanitarian aid, oil, identity, and statehood. To her left is Ambassador David Kapia of Tanzania. He's former Chief of Operations for UNHCR at headquarters in Geneva, has led several UNHCR missions throughout the African continent, currently serves as an advisor to former President Mpaka of Tanzania, who himself was the chairperson of the UN's High Panel for the referendum. Ambassador Kapia, we are pleased that you were able to travel all the way from Tanzania to be with us in Atlanta for these few days. To his left is Ambassador Alan Goulty, former UK Special Representative to Sudan and Darfur. He currently is a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in DC. To his left is Ambassador Timothy Carney, the last accredited, and I emphasize last, accredited US ambassador to Sudan. And I'd ask him to say why that's an interesting adjective there. in light of current relations between the government of the United States and the Republic of Sudan. Dr. John Ruach arrived yesterday evening from Juba. He is a dual citizen from not only South Sudan, but also from the UK. He is an esteemed intellectual, and Jeff will be the first to tell you that we consult him on a regular basis in the field. Dr. Ruach has been very much at the forefront in his newfound country of Britain to help mobilize diaspora voices, many of whom would find friends here in the audience, towards having a constructive platform for discussion about their respective home countries. Jeffrey Mappinderry is the Carter Center representative for peace programs in South Sudan and oversees, as I indicated, both political observation work as well as exploring how our legacy as the center can be of some assistance to mitigating ongoing security threats within the South itself. Prior to his current role, Jeff was a senior advisor to the UN Mediation Unit in New York, where he was seconded to the Doha process on Darfur and was advising Darfuri rebel groups on behalf of the UN to, in a sense, engage in a more constructive manner in Doha. I end there and would perhaps throw out a controversial question, Deb, not to preempt your moderation or to change the tone of the discussion, but I recently came across a quote from Dante's Inferno that reminded me of a constant question that we ponder at the Carter Center around neutrality. And he says, the darkest places, forgive my language, of hell are reserved for those who maintain neutrality in situations of moral crisis. Arguably, more than arguably, very tangibly, Sudan and South Sudan are in crisis, internally and externally. We welcome you and look forward to hearing your remarks. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Atunde, and thank you, Sita, for that introduction. We appreciate it. So what I'd like to do tonight is to start out by talking a little bit about Sudan and some of the challenges facing it. Then we'll talk a little bit about South Sudan and some of the challenges facing it, and then we'll move into the conflict between the two states. So let's start out with the Arab Spring, which has been shaking regimes across the region. But in Sudan, we still see the regime of President Omar Bashir in power after 20 years. Ambassador Gulti, could you comment on that for us?
Is this working? Can you hear me? Well, as I've been singled out first from this distinguished panel, let me save everybody else's time by expressing our collective thanks both to the Institute at Emory and to the Carter Center for inviting us all here. Personally, I'm particularly sorry to have missed the session on mediation at the law school, partly because I spent a great deal of time attempting to support the mediation in the CPA process and in Darfur, and I should have liked to be a participant in that discussion too. As regards the Arab Spring, let me make 3 quick points. Firstly, in Sudan, there is a history of popular street revolt. In 1964 and in 1985, the governments were overthrown primarily because of popular agitation. Would that happen today? Well, in Sudan, the street agitation is not just of the street ordinary people. It tends to be led by intellectuals, traditionally from students at the University of Khartoum, but especially in those 2 instances I've cited, by professional organizations like the Doctors Association, the Bar Association, and so on. It seems to me that in the circumstances of today, any professional intellectual person is going to ask himself, if I come out into the street, what am I going to be lobbying for, and what do I want to achieve? Regime change is okay as a slogan, but what comes next? It's not going to be an ignorant mob who comes out in Sudan. It's going to be people who ask themselves a question of, who am I for? And in Sudan, most of the alternatives have been tried already and found wanting. That's the first point. Second point is, what lesson will the Sudanese government take from the experience of the Arab Spring elsewhere? Well, I don't think it takes a genius to assess that somebody like President Bashir is likely to take the view that the Egyptian army or President Bashar al-Assad in Syria is a better model than the Ben Alis and Qaddafis. So you're likely to get a tough resistance and clamping down on any manifestation, any popular manifestation in the streets. And the government still have a lot of assets in terms of the army, in terms of the security services they can deploy in support of an effort to hang on if that becomes necessary. Third point is, what is the impact of the Arab Spring likely to be? Let's look provisionally, because it's only provisional as yet, at the results. You have a popular election in Tunisia giving an Islamist party the plurality of the votes. You have the main opposition in Egypt, the Muslim Brothers, reinforced by a 25% vote for Salafist parties. In Syria, you have a growing feeling that the opposition is Islamist or Muslim Brotherhood in inspiration. Islamist in meaning Sunni Islamist against the Alawite, Druze, Christian coalition that is supposed to support the government. In Yemen, you have a vibrant Al-Qaeda presence. Now, if you're President Bashir, looking at all this Arab Springery, you don't say, wow, this is democracy at work. You say, oh my goodness, look at the rise of people who think like me. And in Libya, where you have a strongly Islamist influenced temporary transitional government, you have got an end to Libyan meddling in Darfur and anti-regime meddling in Khartoum. So from the government's point of view, all this looks pretty good. Arab Spring, good for you, not so good if it happened here, but it's not going to happen here because I'm going to clamp down on it. So in general terms, and given that additionally the present Sudanese government is supported by Qatar, which is generally believed to be behind the sort of more moderate Muslim Brotherhood presence elsewhere in the Middle East, in general terms, the government is likely to do pretty well out of the Arab Spring. And that's my short answer, or long answer, to your question, Deborah, except that today there is reported to be a mob of 1,000 or more southern Sudanese throwing stones in the main souk of Khartoum because of the attempt to repatriate them to the south on terms that are unacceptable. Now, that could be the Bouazizi of Sudan. It's possible that if you had riots in the street, you had counter-demonstrations, the situation could get out of control, and the smooth analysis I gave you just now will be proved to be completely wrong.
Thank you, Ambassador Goldie. Is there anybody else who'd like to jump in on that question? No? Oh, Ambassador Carney.
Well, you never know about the press, right? And what you're seeing every now and again in the press, whether it be the FT or something with equal intellectual realities, are conversations with younger Sudanese who are saying we've had enough of all this and it's time for a change. this is not to deny any single one of Alan's points. And Itondi, let me recall that while I was the U.S. ambassador in Sudan, my neighbor, who was right across the street, was Alan Gulti and his wife Lillian. I would occasionally bring fresh veggies up from Nairobi in the dry season and the hot season, and he would ply me with products of the springs and the malt of Scotland, as you might expect of a man named Gulti. So, in other words, there is clearly a ferment there. Now, whether it needs the kind of spark that Alan has raised at the very end, or whether it is in fact essentially bootless, witless, and pointless, is something that maybe we need a Sudanese or someone who is so steeped in things that are going on in Khartoum to talk about.
Well, Jeff, I wonder if you can comment at all on if we're not going to have an Arab Spring and yet there's a ferment, is there any likelihood that the process of devising a new constitution could be a vehicle for a new Sudan, a change?
Oh, thank you very much. I'll make a few comments, then I'll leave others also to complement. Well, in addition to what has already been expressed in terms of responses to the question on Arab Spring and what it means to Sudan, I can also add that having in Khartoum and Juba, but I just came from Khartoum recently and I've been in and out several times. Talking to a lot of people, we meet many people, including students at universities, professors, civil society, diplomats, and a lot of other people in the work we do. And as neutral as we can be. But gathering information, sometimes you hear a lot of people complaining that sometimes their inability to effect change through demonstrations we see in other places is due to the fact that young people are getting disillusioned and they are losing appetite in politics because of the nature of the opposition parties as well. Yes, the ruling party or the NCP, they have a lot of mechanisms and of course state apparatus they can use to suppress or oppress any type of demonstrations. But also at the same time, there is also a belief that the opposition parties that are existing in the present moment are not very much appealing because you still have the old guys who are still at the top of those political parties. And there doesn't seem to be any change. There's something wrong. I can raise my voice. I'm on a full stomach. So what I can say is that they are also saying they need to see change within these political parties as well to aspire or to inspire the young people. They're saying that even al-Bashir, though they might not like him, but he's much younger than those in other political parties. And they also see that by a small group of people related somehow, it's either they've been in power before, they're out and in again. So, you know, they tend to be eating from the same plate. So they're not really inspired. During the elections, I happened to be in Khartoum again in 2009, 2010. You could see that there was momentum building. There were also some demonstrations, but you could see that characters like Yasser Arman was also inspiring during that time because some people could identify with him even though he was older, but he was much younger than other political players. So it's an issue that is also contributes to some of the things we are seeing on the ground. And further on, you said you wanted me to explain on what?
About the process for devising a new constitution.
Yes. As we already know, there is this discussion on the constitutional review process, which is supposed to be happening. So far, not much has happened in that direction, but there was a lot of discussion within civil society and other groups and political parties as well. We believe it's a great opportunity to use that as a mechanism to solve some of the problems that might exist, because of if a process is inclusive and fully participatory, and people's contributions are well respected, and then contribute to the final outcome of the review process, we strongly believe that might help other people to feel that they have been included and they also have been participating in the process. But right now, yes, there's political discussion as to that process, but events on the ground haven't really translated into a lot of action. But we have seen that the government itself, they have recently announced that they will start the discussion of selecting members of the commission or committee. They haven't named it yet. But given that there's a multitude of problems in Sudan, northern Sudan, but you remember also there's a similar process in the south, so on both directions. So it's not only in the north, but in the south as well. But in the north, we have all these other areas that are still problematic: Blue Nile, Southern Kordofan, and Darfur. And people are now wondering if this process can be used to solve some of those problems by giving people an opportunity to say what they want and what they aspire to in those areas. And if that could be discussed and answered through the Constitution, then it might guarantee other people in terms of whether they feel included in governance issues or not, whether they feel included socially. It might answer to some people who are considered to be minorities and also to have historical grievances. But at the same time, there are also questions surrounding whether it is viable to hold such type of consultations and review process within the prevailing security situation, especially in Darfur, Southern Kordofan, and Blue Nile. So these are issues we can discuss, we can continue to discuss, and I'll let other people also speak to that. But generally, I just spoke on behalf of the North, but also the similar process is taking place in the South. And we are busy trying to observe the development of that process. And we strongly believe that the product can be as good as the process. So if the process is good, maybe what might be achieved at the end might be very helpful to the people of Sudan. So we try by all means to help in the best way we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned Darfur. You just brought up Darfur, and I'd like to talk about that for a little bit. And maybe Ambassador Gulti, you could start out by telling us a little bit about where you see Darfur headed for this year. It's been relatively quiet for the last year or so since the signing of the Doha Agreement. What do you think is likely to happen this year now that the rebels have agreed to a unified front with Kordofan and Blue Nile?
You know, Deborah, in our game of rugby, there is a thing called a hospital pass. I think in American football it's called a lateral. And a hospital pass is when you execute a lateral in such a way that the oncoming tackler arrives at just the same time as the ball. So you get completely shattered and fail to catch the ball. This seems to me a question that comes under the category of a hospital pass. And I'm wondering whether Ambassador Kapia, who's been exempted so far, might not like to start. And then when I've had a chance to recover, and assuming he drops the ball, I will try and pick it up.
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to start by joining my voice to his to thank the organizers of this event and say how much I feel happy to be here in the middle of this great center of learning. I want to tell you that where I come from, we have heard a lot about Atlanta. Atlanta has produced great people, and Emory University is world famous. And why shouldn't I be happy to be in the middle of all these distinguished scholars? So thank you very much. Now, I join you again to talk about Darfur. But before I talk about Darfur, I want to tell you that as an African, I really feel sad because history tells us that the history of the Sudan, or the recent history of the Sudan, is a history of wars. Since 1955, I think the Sudan has not rested. If they did, then it was for a few years here and then after the Anyanya 1, 55 to 72, then the Anyanya 2, 83 to 2005. And we all hoped that after 2005, the Sudanese people would live like all of us in total peace and security. But as you might have heard from the preceding speakers, that is not to be. From what I know of my few missions in the Sudan, Darfur, the Darfur problem goes back into the 70s. It's a beautiful area. I've been to Darfur several times. It's a beautiful area, and you just wonder, why do the politicians make their people suffer like this? One day we were driving out of El Geneina, the capital of Western Darfur, going south, and we had been warned by the UN security people not to travel by road, but then we said in order to see and assess the conditions on the ground, we have to go by road. So we went by road 100 kilometers south to a place called Habila. We spent the night there. Then the following day we went eastwards to a place called Morne, near the Jebel Mara Mountains. We met the Janjaweed. You must have heard about these people. The Janjaweed, I waved at them, and I spoke my little Arabic, and they let us pass. But the following day, a truck which came on that road, they were all wiped out. There's no village left standing. I grew up in a rural area of Tanzania, so a village, you have huts, you have farms. What I saw in Darfur, along that road of about 200 kilometers, no village is left standing. There was no farm because everything has been burnt to the ground. In the meantime, in the recent past, we've been following the Doha process. We were very optimistic and thought that the Doha process would really put things to rest, and people who are in Chad, in the camps in Chad, or who are in the internally displaced camps in the Sudan, would go back to their normal lives. But the Doha process, I'm sorry to say, has been very slow, very slow. We met President Thabo Mbeki in Khartoum when President Carter was there, and he briefed us on this slow process. Last week, we all had hope that now I think they have come to some sort of agreement. But yesterday, I think, or today, talking to Iton, they says no. I think they have. I don't know what has happened. They are fighting again. With the killing of the leader of one of the rebel movements there, we thought maybe the rebels would now come together and agree to a peaceful settlement. But that is Darfur. It's still ongoing. And since I have the floor now, Madam Moderator, I will talk a little bit about Kordofan. My colleague touched about South Kordofan, Blue Nile. I will add the Eastern Front also, to show you that the North, even though the South has become independent, one also thought that now they will have some breathing space and concentrate on development of their own country. But again, there is, it's not to be, because in South Kordofan and Blue Nile are what are called the transitional areas. Transitional areas in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, there was an agreement that consultations would be made in such a way that when they reach the 9th of July, when the South maybe opts to go, then some agreement would have been reached in these two states, also to decide whether to go south or to stay with the North. But the consultations, I think the Carter Center has also been following that process. It was very slow and really stalling, very slow, up to a point that the people started manifesting, and there has been brutal repression, bombings. The Sudanese armed forces went in there. At one stage, they are talking of genocide, massacring people in the villages, in the Nuba Mountains. You must have heard the Nuba Mountains. And of course, for the new Republic of South Sudan, this is the first time now they are getting refugees. So you have more than 60,000 people who have escaped from South Kordofan into Unity State, some into Warab State. Access is difficult, even for some of the UN staff who are based in Juba. It's difficult to reach the refugees. The Sudanese Air Force came and bombed that Jau village you were talking about. So there's no peace. In Blue Nile is at the northeast corner of South Sudan now. A few months ago, there was a massive buildup of the Sudanese armed forces. Their tanks rolled into Blue Nile, and they just said that they would crash. Sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead.
They would crash any attempt to impinge or to infringe on the sovereignty of the Sudan. So the consultations have not gone on well. The Eastern Front, up there bordering Eritrea, is a little bit quiet. There was some agreement, I think, a couple of years ago, and it has been a little bit quiet there. But all in all, the picture is not that good. I said at the beginning that we really feel sad because the Sudanese people need peace, security, which are a prerequisite to what we call development. If there's no peace and security, no development. I won't touch about the South.
Okay. Thanks so much. Yes, let's turn our attention to the South now. And Dr. Ruach, if you could talk to us a bit about what the challenges for governance are for the new state of South Sudan. You're facing all kinds of issues there, ethnic conflict, warlordism, corruption. Can South Sudan rule itself?
First of all, I would like to express my appreciation to the center, and in particular, Carter Center that made this gathering more possible. Of course, as time goes by, people will begin to realize the vision of Carter, which sometimes I would regard as having some messianic element in terms of his experience after having left the office and how he sees the world as we all see today and the problems that are facing us, and how he also carved himself the responsibility
of certain areas like peace, health, and other issues. Coming to that question of whether South can govern itself or not, if I'm to be a little bit philosophical, it's a question of whether an individual or whether a person can control himself. Because you see, when you look at a country, it boils down to individuals. When you look at the individuals, it boils down to the team leaders, people who control. After having struggled for over 55 years for what they have achieved at last, I think what you will recall is how did they manage over all these years, despite the split in their struggles from 55 to 72, when they had that brief accord between 72 to 83. It was seen as if South would not manage, but yet they surprised the world that within 10 years, South was able to manage their own affairs. And despite the fact that at the time it was a one-party system, Sudan Socialist Party led by Emory, South went a long way to change the system by introducing a contest which surprised the people of Khartoum. They defied that one-party rule, and even other outside observers did admire the way South conducted itself. I think the same thing is possible now, although 30 years on, things have changed. The mentality, the perspective, the knowledge, the experience the people of the South have gained, the outside world, our relationship with the North. But yet, I can say South will at some point be able to rule itself. Now we have got a lot of problems. So the concentration is how to avert the pending issues. We hurried with the 6 protocols. Unfortunately, we only managed to accomplish 4 or 5. We couldn't resolve the one of Abyei, which in a way might have a bearing on the administration of the South as to whether that would destabilize or it could be control remains one. We have the 2 protocols, the one of Southern Blue Nile, the one of Southern Kordofan, all have got bearing on the administration of the South, whether that would destabilize or delay setting up a strong government in the South will remain to be seen in the way the current leaders are dealing with the issues. We have got the border problems, the oil. Rather, I think the big headache we have is when you are administering a nation or a country or an entity without clear borders. And if that would affect the administration of the South, is because we have not yet concluded the border arrangements. The question of corruption. I don't condone corruption. We don't support it. It's being tackled. There's an anti-corruption commission set up. The president is firm on that. There are rumors about those who have been involved, and that is going to be looked into. I'm not glozing over it. Corruption is almost a big problem worldwide, but that is not also a good excuse. But I'm saying that South is no exception, but with a strong leadership, which is now
Okay.
showing up, I think they will solve it. As for the internal problems, which might have also regional or international bearing, like the crisis we have in some states, and in particular in Jonglei, which has now involved the representative of the UN, those who have the UNMIS there, is being monitored. Although action, the government couldn't respond when they had all the necessary indications that there was a looming ethnic or tribal tension and could erupt any time. It was averted in the last minute. That one could explode any time, but it's now under control. There were feelings, or there were some opinions from different quarters as to whether to declare the state of Jonglei, where I come from and where I also worked previously in my heydays as a young officer after graduation. And I'm familiar with the problems given my local knowledge and experience dealing with the tribes in that part of the South. Two proposals were considered, whether to declare it as a disaster zone or a state of emergency. There was a strong opinion that a state of emergency would help address the issue quickly, because that would involve setting up a military administration with a strong government and to root out these issues. But that was avoided. They decided to go for the lesser option, disaster area, which now has involved the humanitarian organizations working in the South. But the proposals they have come up with is that first we'll have the government intervention by deploying the military, the police, and then also the UNMIS on one side, the peacekeeping forces. They are there in the area, to be followed by the humanitarian work, and they are already there on the ground. That will be the second phase. And the third one, peace mediation, which will also take place after these two, the two phases are completed.
Okay.
When?
Thank
we
you
do not
so
know.
much, Dr. Ruach. Thank you. Let's just move on, since we're running out of time for this part of our program tonight, to the conflict between the Sudan and South Sudan. And particularly, it's going to be hard for either South Sudan or Sudan to govern without money, or particularly if they get involved with a new war, which brings us to the question of the oil. And Ambassador Carney, I wonder if you could comment for us on what you think is likely to happen now that the talks have broken down in Addis Ababa over the question of Sudan's oil.
Thanks. First of all, let me set forth a principle which everyone who studies that oxymoron called political science ought to be aware of. I did history myself. And that is, leaders act in what they think are their interests. And you can never forget that as a diplomat. People act in what they think are their interests. The challenge is, how do we get them to accept our definition of their interest? And more to the point, who can help, or who is a critical actor in helping this process? So what we have seen happen, just as Etondi noted, is the talks in Addis are now in abeyance. The spokesman for the foreign ministry in Khartoum said they will resume at the end of the month. He also suggested that there might be developments on two rather important issues. One is trade and the other is citizenship. Now, this is talk, right? It's just talk. What we have to do is see who's actually doing something to see it happen. especially on the oil. We've got Pagana Mum, who is a gadfly and who drives Northerners crazy, at least so they reliably tell me, saying they've stolen 6 million barrels, tons, I can't remember the unit of measure, of our oil, and they aren't letting the ships load. And this is a huge problem. Well, it's a bigger problem than that because you've got all of the press who does oil saying, what is the matter with the South? If they aren't getting oil revenue, they're going to go down the drain. Because there are two critical lacks in the South, and they are both in the realm of infrastructure. One is the physical infrastructure, no roads, to wit. And the second is the human infrastructure, inadequate numbers of people to actually do the work of governance. So if you don't have money, you don't have either. Unless, of course, USAID, are we on Chatham House rules here, Tonde? Oh, thank you. Unless USAID gallops to the rescue, much in the way Qatar has for Khartoum. They pledged $2+ billion for Khartoum just a couple of days ago. You've got to get the oil done. It is a vital aspect of both countries seizing the opportunity to move their very complementary economies forward into the future with consequent benefit to their relationship. That's what oil's all about, and that's why it has to happen. How do you do it? Somebody's got to convince some Northerners and some Southerners that their interests lie in getting their act together.
Okay, is there anybody else who'd like to jump in on that question with the oil? Jeff?
I think it's well answered. I think the issue of oil, as we in our discussions this afternoon, was raised as well, but people were saying it's one of the major problems, but we also discovered that oil came later and the problems were there before. And I think it's also related to other political issues which were not resolved, as I mentioned earlier on. So the issue of oil comes as something people can, maybe politicians can also use as tit for tat, hoping that, as the ambassador has indicated, what they believe is in their best interest. But sometimes which might not turn out at the end that it is really, they're achieving that through that same method they're using, maybe shooting themselves in the foot. But we don't know now at the present moment. Maybe it might work for the South, but we never know whether it was also going to work for the North. But what I'm trying to say is that it is within the bigger spectrum of issues that haven't been resolved that is also fueling that debate and also just worsening the situation. But at the present moment, we don't see any way out because the discussions are not achieving much. Yes, as Itonde indicated, there was a memorandum of understanding that was reached, but we expected to see something reached on a decision on the oil, but it didn't come. So we are still waiting again to see if it is going to come, but they still, and you know the South said, we cannot only discuss the oil now, let's discuss all other pending issues in terms of border demarcation, citizenship, and all those other issues. And we know there are already problems that are linked to these discussions. We're not talking about South Dakota Fund and Blue Nile, issues not resolved, and then in whose interest is it to solve the border issues right now, when you're also talking about disputed areas where oil exists. So I think there's still a lot of problems to resolve.
Okay. Okay. Did you want to add something?
I think it's worth going back to the CPA, which it looks to us now inevitably led to secession of the South. I can tell you it certainly did not when it was being negotiated. Secession was not negotiable. So the whole CPA depended on the agreement to try to make unity attractive. Yes, there was another option, but it was not to be spoken of. So the effect of that was that the three areas were not seriously dealt with, because if you look at the provisions for each of them, Abyei, Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile, they were much less difficult and much less threatening within the context of one Sudan. They become much more difficult in the event of secession. Because we weren't looking at secession, there are no provisions for division of oil revenues, settling of borders, and so on in the CPA. There's not even a provision for a process in the a contingency arrangement, if you like, if the vote eventually went for secession. Hence the problem. The North never thought that secession was likely and are bitterly wounded by what they see as being rejected. The South distrusted the North to the extent that they focused only on secession and not on the associated problems and issues and development and so on. The referendum and then implementation of the result was their sole focus. So we've got into the position now where I agree with almost everything Tim said, except that I'm not sure that either government is acting in what it regards as its interests, except in the very narrow sense of avoiding criticism from political opponents. What is clear, as Tim said, is that both countries need to work together, whatever the political framework, as good neighbors, or at least as neighbors with a working relationship. And you find that the reactions of the negotiators are motivated as much by emotion, which is not to be ignored, but as by a rational consideration of their interests. So the problem for would-be mediators and diplomats is how to find ladders to get these people down out of the branches on which they've put themselves. And that is an extremely difficult challenge, but probably some of you in the audience are now about to tell us how to do it.
That's right. We'll move on to the second part of our program here, where we'll take questions from the audience. And I understand Dr. Suleiman Baldo is going to start. There you are. Okay. You have a question you'd like to start off with? Could you stand up? And here you go. Here's the microphone. Introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Suleiman Baldo, activist from Sudan. I've been following this for a lifetime. I'm sorry to say things are just getting worse, you know, after all these years, and I don't see, in fact, possibilities of improvement. I believe they will get worse before there is any improvement, definitely. I don't trust the political elites and leadership, either north or south, or in the new rebel insurgent front, to act in the interest of the population. What keeps getting lost constantly to the political elites in the country is that there is a cost for all this brinksmanship, there is a real cost for all this real, basically, chicken game that engaged in this negotiation, which is tens, hundreds of thousands getting displaced, food shortages occur. There are 2.7 million people in IDP camps in Darfur, almost for, 10 years now. So basically, possibilities of easy solutions are not within reach, and we really need to have a different approach. I don't know how. I'm sorry I'm commenting off the cuff because I didn't see this coming, but probably subsequent discussion I can make more coherent people. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anyone else who has a question? Okay. Back there. If you would stand up, we can hear you better.
Certainly. I think that forgive my naivete, but I think that for many of us, for these long ongoing conflicts around the world, there's broad consensus about what, in broad brushstrokes, the solutions will be, and it's a matter of getting people to those places. And I'm wondering, for Sudan, do we understand generally what this will look like when it is solved? Or are we still in that point where we're, however many decades later, trying to figure out what the solution actually is?
I think that sounds like a question for our professional diplomats, I'd say. Ambassador Kapia, would you like to take a shot at that? Well, she said, is this quite so often in these situations, everyone knows the outlines of a solution. It's just a question of how do you get the parties to the place where they need to be, and is that the way it is in Sudan? Do you see a solution, and is it just a matter of getting the parties to agree to it, or how is it likely to shake out?
Well, thank you very much. I think the ambassador stopped short of giving us what to do. My view is that the international community over the years has used enormous resources to get us to where we are in the Sudan, in the both Sudans now. And to agree with what you are saying is that it will be a great pity if we let all that, or all those efforts now go down the drain. Okay, so you have the international perspective, or international responsibility. We are looking at the UN, the European Union, and the international perspective. We are looking at the regional perspectives. You have the African Union, you have the IGAD processes, you have the East African Community, which Sudan is applying to join. You have the International Conference of the Great Lakes regional, and then some local, national perspectives. So what I feel myself humbly is that all these forces put together, we will bring the two components, or the two countries now, together and get a solution. We need to do it. We need to do it. We need to do that now. The other day, President Bashir everybody looks cornered. They're in a tight corner, and the president was saying, if this is the case, during the constitutional review process, that Sharia law should now be institutionalized in northern Sudan. When we were doing the referendum, the activist lawyers in Khartoum, they were praying to the international community that please let us not get to that point. Everybody wants to live a normal life, simple life, and enjoy it. Why not?
Ambassador Coulty, would you like to?
Thanks. Let me make two quick comments. One to my friend Dr. Sleman. When I was leading the British effort in the CPA, I used to say to my staff, we've got to adopt a policy of relentless optimism. And invariably, in the course of the next day, something would occur to make me say, oh, it's hopeless. And the staff would say, Alan, where's the relentless optimism? We've got to keep hoping. Hope is what keeps Sudanese going. Second, the very interesting question of the division between the solutions and the people. Another of my mantras, if you like, used to be, it's not for us outsiders to say who runs Sudan, but it is for us to say how it should be run, because, among other things, the Sudanese government has contracted international obligations in the field of human rights and so on, and we can make our suggestions. Now, it seems to me that where some of the advocates in this country and in mine go off the rails is talking about regime change and who, instead of focusing on what needs to be done in terms of solutions. And if we can get back to looking at the solutions, the question of who implements them is of much lesser importance.
Thanks. Having trashed political science, I'll now borrow a concept from it. This is something Bill Zartman invented more years ago than many of you were born. It's the concept of a situation ripening. And indeed, the situation in Sudan ripened sufficiently, ultimately, to produce in, what was it, 2001, the effort that ended in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. Now, you've got to wonder if there isn't a way to do things like apples or bananas and put a little of the appropriate gas, that may be a wrong metaphor, into the Sudanese situation to accelerate the very process that our questioner is worried about. Yes, we know what the solution ought to look like, and I think Alan has touched on elements of it. Sudan has signed all of the human rights conventions. It is up to Sudan now to live up to its word on that particular aspect of how people treat each other and foreigners in Sudan. How do we get there from here? That's the problem, and we don't know. Although tomorrow we'll figure it out so we can tell President Carter on Friday.
Just a quick comment. Your question, I was just thinking that I wish, I was just praying that if God would turn me into a magician, I would be in a position to tell you exactly what solution we're going to have. I still believe, I'm a strong believer, I'm an optimist. I believe one day we'll find a solution. But my point is that right now it's very difficult to predict what type of solution there might be and how to bring out a solution. But what my position, or also the position of the Carter Center, we believe that it is important to position ourselves as international partners in a way that would enable us to help the parties when they start to discover that they've reached a heading stalemate, as you were citing Zatman. So I think the activities we should be doing, whether it is the United Nations, whether it's the regional community or the international community, is critical in terms of analyzing the situation in a way that makes us capable of reacting or responding positively to the calls when people are now ready for whatever they might be doing. I think it is an internal situation for both countries, but it's also a bilateral situation because nobody can relocate between the two. It's not a bad neighbor that you can buy another house next door and move, but you have to be there. But I think since they managed to get to the CPA, I think there is optimism that they'll still manage to get somewhere. But are we positioning ourselves now so that when time comes, we'll be more useful to the situation?
Another question from the audience.
I think what the question of solution, as Alan did point out, that Sudan, or two Sudans have that obligation, political or moral, because they have signed up to certain international agreements, and there's a possibility of a solution. One thing which he said, relentless opportunism is one, I mean optimism. But you can use, it could be opportunism to some extent if the politicians become too optimistic in getting their way through. But also you can use Caillou's theory. Some highlights of the problem in Sudan, although we are glossing over it. If you look at the situation in the north, people are stuck into their own ideological trends. Whether you use the Arab Spring to bring about change, which the Khartoum government doesn't see that way because they think they are the ideologues who have been behind the move in the Arab world, which the West will have to study because now they're slipped off. It's not as it was first suggested. Let us introduce democracies in the Middle East. Because the people of the Middle East of nowadays are not the same as those of 20 or 30 years back. But we have got a problem, which is another digression, but it has got some bearing on Sudan, because Sudan prides itself in having orchestrated an Islamic movement in the world by having certain countries that will eventually be Islamic. That is a very important thing we must recognize. We will have a battle in Sudan. The relationship between the two countries, yeah, you need to have politicians with moral authority who are steady, who can keep their promises and to their word. And Alan did mention something very important, and we have a diplomat, who really are the key negotiators. And how is the negotiation being passed? Ambassador David did mention all these organizations, the UN, the AU, the IGAD, name them. Do they have a clear strategy, a clear vision, and who lead them? Have they agreed on a certain policy that relates to the so-called solution? People are saying, yes, we have a solution. Who defined that solution? All these are searching questions we need to have. I think we need a new approach for the situation in Sudan, or in the two Sudans. That's the way
Thank you very much, Deborah, for giving me the opportunity. Carlos Andro, and distinguished guests, and my colleague, American friend who are here today from Emory University, and my Sudanese friends who are here, Southern Sudanese. I'm honored to be here today. This is a momentous occasion to attend this panel discussion. What I'm seeing in Sudan is a serious problem. I look at Bashir, the president of Sudan, as a demonic politician and a warmonger. Somebody may wonder, why is this strong words? Sudan just split into two countries. We have South Sudan and Sudan. In South Sudan, we lost 2.5 million, or more than that. 2.5 million displaced. That's the reality. In Sudan, do we know how many people died? A lot of people, same. We just had an independent in the country a few months ago, not even a year. And you know what he's saying right now? We are not accepting what he is saying in regard to the oil. War is a possibility. That is a threat that is trying to put us as the issue right now. It doesn't make sense, and this is the reality. My request to you as diplomats is that we South Sudanese who are outside the country or back home, that the war is not a solution, because the war ends many lives. And the key is to continue support negotiation and continue with the dialogue. That's the only thing that I see the best thing. And I think Bashir needs to be advised or to be warned that Arab Spring is near, even if it is not a possibility, but I think it's going to be a possibility. But he is trying his best to destabilize the South, because he has found out that economic crises are unbelievable in the Sudan. So please, what you have been doing has been incredible. You support the independence of South Sudan, but I'm encouraging you to continue doing the same thing. We need peace. We don't need no more war. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah. Thank you, Ms. Deborah, for the chance. My name is Nathaniel Nyak. I am from the Republic of South Sudan, but most importantly, I'm Sudanese. I have about 3 questions for the panel. One is about the Sudan. As discussed earlier by you and asked the audience as the witness, we said that Sudan kills and denies aid to the suffering populations in Kordofan, in Blue Nile, and also in Darfur. And now al-Bashir is sitting in Khartoum. How different is al-Bashir from al-Gaddafi now in the eyes of the international community? A government that kills and denies food to its population at the same time. How different is he from al-Gaddafi that was just taken out by the international community? Second question is on the oil. Khartoum demanded $32 per barrel. Cuba offers $1 per barrel. And now it has resulted in the shutting down of the production of the oil in the south. And now there's a possibility of war. As personalities that have been to Sudan several times, are these figures sincere on the both sides? Are these figures meant for a stalemate or a peaceful solution? And in your perspective, are these figures making sense? That's another question on the oil. And the last one, I think the international community on the oil too. The international community is doing the mediating part. As the mediator of the Sudan problem, what figure can the world offer in order to bring the two sides together? As maybe I think there are some other landlocked countries with a similar solution. What figure is the world offering these two sides? The last question will straight away go to Dr. John Roach, and it is on the intercommunal conflicts. As a young South Sudanese who comes from Jonglei State, I am profoundly saddened by the conflict. I am affected. I lost members of my family in the recent conflict. I lost members during the war, and I thought the war was going to stop. So this question is going to you now. Where does these ammunitions come from? The ones that are being used by the tribe to fight themselves. Where does they really come from? Where do they really come from? And second, as South Sudanese and you are in Sudan, are these in any case proxy wars? Do you see a hand of a foreigner in this? Thank you.
One more question from Dr. Susan here.
Actually, starting to have my question addressed, which was, in most conflicts and conflict situations, there are outside players that are either facilitating or preventing or exacerbating the conflict. And we've heard a lot about the problems internal to both North and South Sudan, but not about the external interests at this point. What are those external interests, both in resolving the conflict and in perhaps exacerbating it? I haven't heard China mentioned as a player in the oil side, for example.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have a lot of questions from us. Who would like to start? Maybe Dr. Wood, would you like to talk about the question raised about the intercommunal conflicts?
Well, the intercommunal conflict that is raging in Jonglei, first, we have to admit that all these intercommunal conflicts are everywhere in most parts of South Sudan, if not the 10 states, because of cattle raiding or rustling. The situation in Jonglei is a little bit different because it involves child and woman abduction by the Morley. The people who have been badly affected happen to be the Lao Nuer, the Morley, the Dinka. I have to be careful in terms of having been away from the country for long, but I still would not shy away from telling you certain things, because the time I was there, I managed to talk with everybody, the governor of Jonglei, his ministers, his advisors, and the intellectuals from Jonglei, professors or administrators. You asked about where the arms come from. I don't know whether I am to say you should be aware where the arms come from. The Lao Nuer, they were the first to be disarmed. The people of Fangak and Lao Nuer and Duke, I'm using the local names. It may not make sense to the audience, but I'm just trying to be more precise to answer the question. Certain ethnic groups were disarmed, but they morally managed to keep their arms, and they were the people who caused all these problems. Where they got their arms, of course, during the war, people had arms either from the SPLA or from the government of Sudan. And they morally happened to have that opportunity, and those arms were not collected. But the people who were badly affected are the two ethnic groups or two tribes, the Nuer and the Dinka. So in a way, I would say it is the Morle who have the arms. But in terms of numbers, they are a minority. It is the Nuer and the Dinka who are the majority. In that case, the contest is over a grazing land or grazing areas and the water points. As you come from Jonglei, you are aware that during dry season, the people of Pibor usually have problems of water and grazing land. And that's where they come in contact with the Nuer and the Dinka. But they are the people with arms. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Now, who would like to move on to address the question of what the external influences are?
I think that peace in Sudan has to be made by Sudanese. But very many Sudanese groups, emboldened, I regret to say, by the lobbyists for perfectly good reasons in their favor, are looking to the US cavalry or the British Air Force to come and rescue them. If you're expecting outside intervention, you do not negotiate seriously with your internal adversaries. So that poses a real challenge for outsiders. Do you say what you think on the merits of the issue and risk encouraging unreasonable expectations? And we can see a lot of that in the Syrian opposition, which is being coached by well-meaning people from this country. But to what end? Where do we think we're going? Are we coaching them to expect the American Air Force to have no-fly zones over Syria? Are we doing the same for groups in Darfur or Blue Nile or South Kordofan? Well, these are questions that are very difficult, and I don't know the answers. But what I tried to do when I was leading the British team in this negotiation was to, in the CPA negotiation and Darfur, was to keep us entirely neutral as between the parties. We tried to avoid expressing this or that party was our preferred candidate to be ruler or governor or whatever. But that did not mean that we shied away from condemning human rights violations or egregious breaches of ceasefires and so on. It's a very difficult line to tread, but it's essential, it seems to me, that one disabuses all the participants in an internal conflict of the idea that somebody else from outside is going to come and do their fighting for them, and they do not have to make the necessary compromises, whatever it takes, to reach their own agreements. And in that, General Sumbewa, who led the IGAD mediation for the CPA talk, had a very sensible mantra that he repeated to both sides frequently, and that was, look, you are not going to get what you want, but you might be able to negotiate something you can live with and the other side can live with. And that's got to be the target of outside mediators. We try to help the parties find something they can live with that is not ideal from their point of view, but tolerable.
Let me just add a word on the Chinese, who are the inevitable hidden hand, or so everyone thinks, in the Sudan equation. They aren't. Look, people are looking not for the Chinese cavalry, but for the Chinese negotiator to pitch up, I'll use the British expression, come to the fore, and the American English expression, and solve things, because China has such an obvious interest in the oil that is being exported from the terminal not far from Port Sudan, and in access to the minerals that exist throughout Sudan, whether it be the chrome or the gold, or maybe the teak or the mangoes that will eventually be exported from the south of Sudan if they're ever able to get their economically diverse act together. So don't count on the Chinese. Where you can count on them, and this has increasingly been demonstrated over, I would say, the last 10 years, is to show a more rational, in the international responsible player sense, role in going to either the north or the south, and they're in Juba now because they figured it out. They didn't want a secession, but they're there. They will go and say quietly, without all the fanfare you hear from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the media in Washington, D.C., the Secretary of State's press office, even Her Majesty's government. There won't be that kind of fanfare. There will rather be quiet word dropped in what the Chinese believe is the right ear. And I think they still have a special representative, do they not? And he'll be the one going to say, sorry, have you considered this? Or as Cromwell said to the Scottish Parliament, no, never mind.
Say beyond that, to understand Chinese, you have to understand their body language. You don't need to underestimate the Chinese. And I came across that in my early research when I was doing research. Did a lot on China, their policies, and the way they behave. They know their interest. However, regarding the situation in Sudan, I think they will be looking to the Troika, as US, UK, and Norway, who have been in the forefront and are still helping up to now. How they have positioned themselves, who are going to have this round, whether will be involved, or there will be new players, and with a caution also, not to go with the assumption, but to go as learners. They may have the knowledge, but to go as learners regarding the situation in Sudan. And reminded me of my days in the University of Liverpool. One time, a certain Malaysian asked, he said that, look, during the colonial days, when the British deployed their personnel or little civil servants, there were countries where they only send retired soldiers. But countries like India, China, and Sudan, the political civil servants that went there were graduates from Oxford and Cambridge. He pondered a little bit and he said, "Do you want a honest answer?" Well, we were listening. He said, "Yes, we wanted to know." He said, "In actual fact, those countries you are mentioning were used to send the Oxbridge graduates are those countries where people are tough, they need a reasoning, they are not that easy." That's where you heard of General Gordon who went to those countries. But in other countries where we send the soldiers, these are people who just needed to be forced to work, although they have turned out to be the best now. So we want to tackle the situation in Sudan. You have to learn from what I just said now.
Okay. I'm sorry, we've come to the end of our program. I know there's still a lot of questions, but we'll have to hold that for another night. Thank you all for coming.
Just a very quick word. I would refer you to the side there. There are the election reports from the observation mission in Sudan from the last national elections on the side there. It would also be important to note that Dr. Solomon Boldo, who raised the first statement, not question, he introduced himself as an activist. He is the director for African programming at ICTJ and is a guest of IBM and the Carter Center this week. Thank you. Also, it would be important for us to recognize Jeff Senior from Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs, Deputy Director for the Sudan Task Force from Canada. And I'd be remiss not to note my senior colleagues in conflict resolution, Tom Crick, Associate Director, Red Valiam, Director of Conflict Resolution. Finally, to conclude with a point of complexity, if you will, the first legislative assembly in South Sudan following the referendum, so we're talking end of January, beginning of February, roughly, both the Speaker of the House in South Sudan and President Kiir addressing the Legislative Assembly said, unequivocally, they would be the first to nominate President Bashir for the Nobel Peace Prize for his peaceful facilitation of the referendum. That points to the complexity of the situation, and I think opens that relationship quality back up that our panelists were pointing to. Sita, thank you again for hosting us at the final.
You're welcome. And I want to thank everybody for coming this evening and to let you know that we are hoping that this is the first of several discussions on Sudan. And while we're not able to confirm anything yet, we hope to gather with one of the lead negotiators for the Comprehensive Peace Agreement sometime in March. So please keep an eye on our website, www.idn.emory.edu, and the Carter Center's website, and we hope to carry on the conversation with you. And again, a very, very warm thanks to our panelists this evening for sharing their insights and perspectives. Thank you very, very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.